Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back, Noel Keegan. All right, so this time we're building off of what we talked about in terms of effective data management in clinical trials during the setup phase in our previous episode. Now we're going to move forward. We're going to talk about considerations associated with data management when it comes to the maintenance and closeout phases. We have our very own expert, Noel. Like I said earlier, welcome back, Noel.
Thank you very much, Jay. Delighted to be here.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right. So, Noel, once the database is built, what activities are implemented to validate the data?
Yeah, one of my favorite topics, because I think that traditionally there's a sigh of relief. You know, when you've got this setup done, you know, foot off the pedal, relax. You're in maintenance. You can go into cruise control. And it's one thing that we've tried to do a little bit differently ourselves at 𝗺𝗵𝘀𝗀, because as we gather momentum during the build process, we try and maintain that momentum going in towards the maintenance and make sure that within the first 6 to 8 weeks, traditionally, that we would have all of our external data reconciliation listings, all of our coding listings, our specifications for manual listings, or any other form of validation that we want to define in our data management plan. We want to set those up. We want to get them in place as soon as we possibly can. We try to give it approximately 1 to 2 months, but obviously in the medical device diagnostics world, that could be a drop in the ocean in terms of a 6, 7, 8 year trial, or we could have a one and done type of diagnostics study. So all of a sudden, you know, the study is only 3 to 6 months. We want to be really flexible around that. So I think our approach towards maintenance needs to be really considered and careful around the needs of the project itself. So if it's the case, for instance, it's a very small project, we don't want to spend 6 to 8 weeks then as well developing these complex and programmed listings. We want to do things very quickly, effectively, and maintaining the same level of quality. And by doing that, you know, we would approach things slightly differently, and we'd make sure that the same level of quality and attention can be delivered, but done without necessarily programming those listings or reconciliations together. Provided we do have time and that there is at least 12 months within the study itself, we would have the first month or two to be able to program things so that we can have things as automatic as possible. And from that, on a monthly basis, we would actually review our outputs for external data and or for manual listings and make sure that we're delivering new queries and new data. And that's the position that we want to get to. We want to make sure that as sites are entering in the data, we're taking a look at it on a day-to-day basis, and we're making sure that the queries are fresh in the minds for the sites. We're protecting those relationships, and that ultimately we're getting into a very good phase, being able to make sure that data is as clean. And then rolling the clock forward, the ultimate outcome is that the busier we make the conduct or maintenance phase, the easier the database lock or any interim analysis delivery comes, you know, towards the end of the study itself.
There is a logical progression for everything. All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. So, Noel, how do you manage, let's say, external data? And when I say external, I'm thinking core labs, imaging, safety. How do you manage that?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we do is we try and get a test output for the data. What does the data look like? What variables are there? What overlapping variables might be in the clinical database that align with the core lab database? And typically we get header data, you know, things like sites, subject details, visit time points, dates, things like that. So not necessarily the specific values that may be specific to the external database, but things that might actually overlap then as well between both databases. And we perform a reconciliation and get an output automatically then so that we actually have alignment and consistency checks. And what I mean by that is that we look at data that might be present in the external data source, but it's missing from the EDC, or data that's present in the EDC that's missing from the external database, or data that's present in both but inconsistent between one another. So things like, you know, the time point might align, but the date might be out by a day or so. And we can generate queries to the sites so that we make sure that we have both sets of data aligned together. So if there's an incorrect or a data anomaly that we find in the external database, we can share that information with the external data source. Or if it's in the EDC itself, then it can actually be corrected through the site responses itself. So ultimately, by the end of the study, we want to make sure that everything is aligned, and any overlapping data between the external data source and the EDC is carefully considered, and that there's perfect alignment between them. If there's any anomalies at the time of the database lock, that's for us to discuss with the sponsor and make sure that if there is a reasonable explanation for that, we can document that, and we don't need to avoid the database lock. But otherwise, we make sure that everything is aligned and consistent before we lock the database.
Okay. So staying on the validation track, and I think this is going to be of paramount interest to manufacturers and sponsors. What data do you share with your sponsor or manufacturer to determine if the validation is on track?
Absolutely. And I think that this is a really good opportunity for us in data management to work side by side with manufacturers and the sponsor contacts, because ultimately it's their data. Their data needs to be carefully considered, and we're just custodians of that data from the start of the database through to database lock and the archiving process. So what we want to do is we want to look at the data in a number of different fashions and formats. Operationally, the types of reports that we share will be missing visits, missing pages, open answered queries, statuses around SDV verification, re-verification, and PI signatures. That's the type of operational considerations that that sponsors typically want to see. Things for the executive team, they may want, Gantt charts, timelines, they may want oversights, overviews, various different charts and understandings of where we are then as well overall with the data. But what we want to use the status reports for, and the great opportunity that we have when we actually derive and deliver those then as well on a monthly basis, would be to understand what's happening with the data. So are there particular trends? Are there problems that we're noticing then as well through the review of those missing data and the open answered queries? We can look at the most frequent firing queries, for instance, or edit checks that aren't firing at all. And we can understand, okay, are there problems with the data? Are there issues that with the sites that are causing problems? Are there certain queries that are firing too much? And we can understand what do we need to do in order to be able to better this system. And that's why the status reports themselves give us a snapshot overview of where we're at that point in time, and to be able to help be proactive about the cleaning of the data itself going forward. Little things like we might be able to understand, okay, sites are not understanding this query at all. It's firing all the time and their responses are just not really making sense. We can change the edit check if that's incorrect, or we can work with the sponsor to understand, okay, well, this case report format, this particular field is causing problems. Let's provide additional training. Let's create a newsletter to be able to deliver that to the sites and to be able to help them understand things that are causing specific problems at that point in time. So for us, being able to stay on top of the reports and the cleaning of the data help us be able to be a better partner, because we can understand what's happening with the data and to be able to come up with proposed solutions to make sure that we are actually being a better partner for sponsors as a result.
Wonderful. Wonderful to understand all that goes into it. So Noel, how long should it take? I think the keyword is should. Should it take to lock a database from the last patient out?
Yeah, we get this question quite a lot, and we want to see how we can actually be as fast as we possibly can. So no matter what we say, it's almost a negotiation then as well, so what can you be quicker? Ultimately, when we have the last patient out, it's a matter of how quickly can you lock that database. So what our strategy is, regardless of the expectations, would be that approach of making sure that we are cleaning the data on an ongoing basis throughout maintenance enable us to have an efficient lock process. We commit to a 21 calendar day turnaround, so 3 weeks altogether between last patient out and database lock. And the only limiting factor will be that some manufacturers might turn around and say that actually, a particular external data reconciliation or a particular process internally takes longer than that, so we can't commit to that on our side. But for our cleaning within 𝗺𝗺𝗀+, regardless of what the limitations might be with an external vendor or with the sponsor, is that we can still deliver on that ourselves. We can deliver on that and actually proceed further. And it depends on the size and the complexity of the project itself. And it also depends on what type of cleaning requirements are going to be needed then as well towards the end. But ultimately, our approach is that if we have 70 to 80% of the data already locked, by the time that we start that last patient out, we're in a really strong position that we're not just cleaning all of the data, we're cleaning 20 to 30% of that data during that time period. And that's the key to success. So if we're able to be proactive about the maintenance phase, we can be effective then as well coming towards the end and make sure that that 20 to 30% of the data that still needs to be cleaned will be done within that 21-day turnaround time period.
Wonderful. All right. Last question for you, Noel, unless we figure out something during your response, but how do you go about managing archiving?
Absolutely. And it's a really good question because it seems to differ project to project, sponsor to sponsor. And in some cases, what I would say in our processes, it will be the one that deviates most by the end of the study, even though it's at the very end. And the reason for that is that some sponsors have their own processes that they want us to follow. Some sponsors, want us to do all of the study then as well. This is our realm, it's just you guys are the experts. So they want us to be able to run that, and that's perfectly fine either way. And in some cases, it's a hybrid process, a combination of the sponsors' processes with our own. And that's where, things can actually get a little bit meatier and a little bit more interesting than as well towards the end. Ultimately, if we're following our own processes, it typically takes about 1 to 2 months. We tend to look at the completion of our trial master file, making sure that from a database perspective that all accesses have been revoked at that point in time. No further entries can actually be done, so that the data from the database itself and any external database can be archived and delivered to the sponsor, that we've got what we call archival material, and that material is ultimately completed and closed. So at a site level, sites can acknowledge through a form that we would send that all of the data has been completed, and that there's no issues, no erroneous materials or activities or data that needs to be delivered. And at that stage, we decommission the database. So we haven't really come across that ever beforehand, but we do prepare for the fact that recommissioning may be required if issues are noted after the database has been decommissioned. But that's in a very rare situation where we might find that, a data anomaly occurs affecting the primary or secondary endpoint data, or the sponsor comes and says, we want to do something that hasn't actually been done beforehand, even though the database has been decommissioned. And again, we want to be flexible to be able to manage that situation if and as it arises. But personally, I've never really seen that actually happen.
Okay, but there is provision for that in case it does. All right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, Noel, thank you so much for talking to us about data management during study maintenance as well as study closeout. And for those of you who haven't seen the previous video, Noel went into depth about database setup, database management during the study setup phase. Thank you very much, Noel, for sharing your experience and expertise.
Thanks for your time, Jay. Appreciate it.